Welcome back to the Blue Ridge Breakdown. I am your host, Troy Miller, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by author, professor, historian, Professor Harvey J, who I also consider a friend. I think that goes both ways. He's the author of over a dozen books, including I have my copy of The Fight for the Four Freedoms here, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. I will also note that it is a heavily dog-eared copy. I basically every other page has information that I said, oh yeah, I want to come back to that. But today I'm really excited to talk about Thomas Paine, kind of building off of conversations we've had on the channel and on the Substack recently, and what many viewers may know, my work on the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights to get it adopted. Professor Harvey J is the co-author of that 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights, along with Progressive Democrats of America Executive Director Alan Minsky. And so with all of that kind of quick table setting, Harvey, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Look, you and I have known each other. That realize we've known each other for as many years as we have, or at least I failed to put it all together. Going back to Tom Hartman, the moment that I was recording with Tom in DC, I forget the year, in fact, but it's a good number of years ago. And it's always good to see you. You and I had a lot of conversations as you were advancing the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights in the West Virginia Democratic Party. And I want to make it clear to everyone listening, and I assume more West Virginians and others may well be listening, is that if we ever secure the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights, you are one of the state level pioneers, and both Alan and I just adore you for that. Thank you. And anything you ever need from me, you just don't hesitate to ask.
You're too kind, and the verb I keep on going back to is I shepherded the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights to adoption, to resolution adoption, and I am proud that we are it's too few states, but the fact that West Virginia is the Democratic Party in the country right now that has this in our platform and not
Right.
just adopted by resolution.
That's right.
I am proud of that, and I hope other state parties will join us very soon. It's never been more important to have a cogent vision of what we are fighting for rather than just what we are in opposition to.
Right.
Right.
As you know,
Please.
as you know, the Democratic Party nationally is literally barely there. It's barely there. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, for a start, it may well be true that Trump and the MAGA Republicans are falling in the polls, but I'm not so sure the Democrats are necessarily ascending in the polls.
Right.
And what the Democrats lost a long time ago, well, in my life it's not a long time ago, but it's a long time ago. What they lost in the course of the 1970s was both this commitment that had enabled them to become the most significant history-making party in the 20th century, and that is the commitment to the working class, which by way of labor unions that were much stronger then than they are now, were committed themselves to advancing the Democratic Party because they believed that the Democratic Party was the party of the people. And the second point is that not only did they lose that connection to the working class, they lost their connection to the most important president, the greatest president of the 20th century, who for all of his faults and failings truly is the greatest president of the 20th century, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. And the vision that Roosevelt cultivated in his fellow citizens, which then was so strongly embedded that they then pushed him likely even further than he might originally have planned to go. And the Democrats, whose very existence had depended upon those kinds of things, turned their backs on the working class and also turned their backs on the FDR tradition. Now, if the Democrats are to recover, look, they could possibly win the House because the Republicans and MAGA president is just so abysmal that they could win possibly the House. But if we're ever going to see not simply more and more of the same back and forth, if we're going to see, if you like, a transcendence from this authoritarian moment, and we're beyond just a crisis of democracy, we're like staring into the abyss right now, then they're going to have to remember who they are and they're going to have to cultivate and develop a vision, which we hope the 21st century economic bill of rights can be the groundwork for doing. Um, Anyhow, so I know we're here today to talk about my childhood hero, the godfather, maybe we could even say the father of Social Security, which is at the root, fundamentally at the root of every single call thereafter for some kind of Social Security or social democratic America.
Yes, and I just want to quickly, as an addendum to your 2 points, say this conversation has come up a lot on the interviews I've had so far, and I think it'll continue to come up. But Democrats lost their way is one way of saying it. I'd say money in politics bought the party, right? They were pulled away from leadership in a lot of ways, and Democratic policies from the New Deal created the greatest middle class in
Right.
history out of basically thin air that the world has ever seen. And then all of that, for all of that money got turned around. All of that wealth that was created by the middle class got turned around and is now siphoned up to the point where we has to have this incredible inequality that would, I believe, have Thomas Paine rolling in his grave. And that's where we can pick up
Yeah.
here of like,
Right. As a
because I think
sidebar,
there's
by
a
the way.
direct connection between the
Yeah.
tremendous inequality and the lack of social security.
Yeah. And as a sidebar, not to make too light of anything we say, we don't even Thomas Paine doesn't even have a grave site any longer. I mean, he was buried in New Rochelle, New York, where a cottage had been afforded him and a bit of land. And then later, the an Englishman who had come over to the States, originally as a conservative, went back to England and then came back to the United States as a very radical kind of guy, William Cobbett. He had Paine's coffin dug up and took it back to England, where he placed it in a barn, hoping to build a monument to Paine in England. And what happened? Well, we don't know if we don't know. The barn may have burned. The the coffin got lost. There is no grave site for Thomas Paine. In fact, I used to like the original the story I liked to imagine was that when he was taking it back to England, the ship had encountered terrible weather and the coffin got, planted in the sea somehow. And as a consequence, given his role in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the making of the small d democracy movement in England, there he was in the middle of the Atlantic.
That's an incredible piece of I don't want to call it trivia, but and now that we've gotten all the way to where Thomas Paine may or may not remain today, let's go back to the beginning and just
Yeah.
I'll just leave it very open to say, who is Thomas Paine? Why does he matter to us? Why did he matter at his time where he was alive? You mentioned all of these different places and times where he wrote and lived. And I think it's one thing I'll say at the outset is it is certain to me that Thomas Paine was taking in through his interactions with others was shaping his view of the world and how we could
Yes.
improve it. But with that, I don't want to go off on a big monologue. I will just say that's how revolutions and rebellions and revolutions and everything start is with one-on-one conversations and with being in the community and all of that. With that, who's Thomas Paine? Why did he matter then? Why does he matter now? And I'll let you take it away from
Okay,
there.
at the most general level, the place that every school kid learns, first of all, the dates. So he was born in 1737 in Thetford, England, a small town to the northeast of London, some ways out, but not terribly far north. His life extends until 1809, and he dies, in fact, here in the United States. He dies in New York City, as a matter of fact. In the middle of all of that, all those years, he grew up in England. I will tell in short in a moment. He comes to America. It's not yet the United States. Okay, he comes because he's encouraged to do so by someone he had met a number of times and who had befriended him, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin had persuaded Paine or convinced him or urged him or said, yes, go, the only thing, go west, young man. Although he wasn't so young, Paine, he was already 37 years old at the time. So it was Franklin who encouraged him to come to America. I'll come back to that moment in a little while. The key thing about Paine is that it was America that made him a revolutionary, a radical. And he returned the favor by being the author of the pamphlet Common Sense that turned the American Revolution. Sorry, let me take that back. The American Rebellion, because up until January of 76, there was no call for independence. The idea was that the American people, as such, wanted to have their rights as Englishmen recognized. And what does that mean? Well, we turned it into the slogan, no taxation without representation. But actually, it was no legislation without representation. Because as far as they were concerned, they wanted to be represented in Parliament. Okay. Though I will point out, England did not have a democracy. Okay,
Right.
it was a monarchy, a somewhat constitutional monarchy, but it was also the case that if probably 2 out of every 20 white males in England could vote because of the property requirements to be able to exercise the vote. English politics was
Right.
utterly corrupt and utterly rotten. Okay. But in fact, the Americans probably had a more quasi-democratic set of polities over here in North America than the British did. But as long as Parliament, by way of legislation, and the king by way of, commanding, could rule over Americans, and Americans didn't have the representation, they hardly felt like they were in some kind of truly democratic order. But the democratic spirit was already a part of it. In fact, let me put it this way. So Paine comes out of a working class background. Okay, he had a limited number of years in school. He became an apprentice to his father, who was a corset maker. Yes, a corset maker. And this would have been, when Paine was 13 years of age. From 13 to about 19, he worked as a corset maker with his father. It was a terribly difficult career. It was a difficult craft to pursue, not just because of the skill it took to create corsets, but also because the market was not very conducive to success. Okay. And so they had a hard time, his family. They weren't poor. They were what you would call humble. I think that's the way the English would have described it.
Okay.
Um, Also, it's notable that his father was a Quaker, his mother was an Anglican, which provided for a fair bit of tension in the family. And both of them influenced Paine. Paine's mother literally demanded that he learn and to a great extent memorize the Bible. His father, okay, was teaching him a skill and craft, was telling Paine every day, probably in the workshop, of how the Quakers themselves had emerged in the 17th century, which was a very revolutionary century in England. As I used to tell my students, it's when England taught the French how to take off the head of a king in a revolution. And so his father was talking to him about the he was not alive then, but was recounting basically the struggles of the 17th century of religious dissent, political dissent, and in many quarters, the demand for political democracy, that working men should have the right to vote, which did not happen, just for the record. Okay, so Paine has this sort of dual background, you might say. The other thing is, however, that he becomes an extraordinary writer in part because his father, as a Quaker, would not allow his son in the years he was in school to learn Latin. He put him in, there was like the Latin track and the strictly English track. The Latin track were for boys who were probably destined to go into medicine or the law, something like that. His family couldn't even imagine that kind of career for him. And not to mention, as a Quaker, there was no way he was going to have his son learn Latin. But I'll also add in 18th century England, which we're talking about, the only folks who were really truly subjects in a citizen-like fashion were Anglicans, which in this country became known as the Episcopal Church. Okay, the emerging Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, Catholics and Jews, they were just tolerated religions. Okay, tolerated, which also then meant that many educational advancement was out of the question for such people. Universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, were very conservative institutions. You could only get degrees in in or in classics or divinity. That was it, classics or divinity. So anyhow, there began another alternative educational tradition. The artisan class of in which Paine grew up were autodidactic students. That is, they had some standing, they weren't merely laborers, and they wanted to learn. And they learned not only by way of what they read, and they were avid readers, the artisan class, but also in where there was a sizable population, they would hold their own classes, you might say, lectures and conversations in pubs and taverns. And they would actually invite people, renowned artisans, to talk about what we would think of as physics and astronomy and geometry and other kinds of things. So Paine grows up in many ways loving, loving learning, but only in school till the age of 13. But anyhow, he learns a lot from his father. He runs away from the apprenticeship when he's 19 and ends up on a privateer, which is a ship that is licensed by the crown to attack enemy shipping. It's like licensed piracy, okay? And he
Right.
spent a year on board. He was well known in his sailing because he was excellent at repairing the sails, given he was a corset maker. Number one. Number two, he proved himself to be pretty adequate with a sword when they confronted other ships and there were boarding parties. And he also himself learned about life between the devil and the deep blue sea. And by the way, the movies wouldn't necessarily have taught us all this, but the ships that sailed the Atlantic, they were multinational crews in many cases, and more than likely multiracial crews. So Paine learned about diversity and comradeship. Goes back to England after a year with some money now in his pocket, and spends a whole year in those artisan coffee shops and pubs learning everything he can about science. He loved science when he was in school. And he also read, he loved poetry, and he even began to probably exercise his poetic license, not in a publishing way, but probably for himself. Now, I'll shorten the story, but to make it clear, he runs out of money after a year as a student, in quotes, as a student. And then he sets himself up outside of London as a corset maker. And in the town where he has gone, he falls in love with a young woman. They get married and they are due to have a child, but the mother and the child die in childbirth. The tragedy, I mean, you can imagine
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, I mean, it's
okay.
hard to
Right.
imagine a harder thing for.
Right. It was very hard for them to make any kind of living from the corset making shop, but her father had been a what we would think of as a customs officer. What they call it in England is the excise office. And they had talked about Paine studying to take the exam to become an excise officer. He returns to his own parents' house and does that. He studies, passes the excise exam, and he becomes an excise officer. And he's assigned a territory in the northeast of England along the coast. Very dangerous occupation to be an excise officer because all these little villages along the coast, these seacoast villages, half the time the villages depended for incomes, not merely on the labor they perform, but even more likely on ships literally going aground or crashing on the rocks. And then they would all swarm to the seaside and collect all that stuff and then sell it themselves. And as an excise officer, he's supposed to patrol the coast, watching out for smugglers and other things. So it's not easy to be a popular excise officer when you're
Right.
doing that kind of thing. Plus, it was again a tough life because you had to cover the expenses of your life and the life of your horse, and the pay was pretty minimal. Well, he is accused of what's called stamping, of not properly stamping the goods that have come into the port. And he's fired. As English say, he was sacked. Okay, so this is a guy who has, if you like, sort of tragedy after tragedy that he has to endure. But it's quite likely that he was framed, that he was not cheating or getting paid off, because he soon applies to be reinstated. And you can only imagine the only person who would be foolish enough to try and get reinstated is somebody who truly believes they're innocent. And apparently, a
Right.
few weeks later, after this his own sacking, they sacked his supervisor, just for the record. Okay. But he spent the next few years trying to survive because they don't, it takes a long time for these guys to decide, the excise commission to decide they're going to bring him back on. And during that time, he makes a living in London, hardly a living, a bare living, as a tutor to middle class children because some of them didn't go to school, but the parents had them, what would you call that? At home schooling kinds of things. He even said about preaching at Methodist gatherings on Sunday. You didn't get paid for that, but you got fed for that. Okay.
Right.
So he did what he could to stay alive, and eventually he's reinstated, and he's sent to the South Coast, to Rye, not to Rye. Sorry, I had friends who lived to Lewis on the South Coast in Sussex, and in Lewis he becomes good friends with the man whose shop he's able to rent a room above the shop from. I'm forgetting this. Samuel Olive is his name. Not that it matters to us here right now. And he becomes a respectable member of the community, even though he's an excise officer. Okay. And he becomes a member of a group called the, the Headstrong Society or the Headstrong Club, which met at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, at the White Hart Tavern. And there they would have dinner, drink beer or whatever else they might want to drink, and argue and debate the public affairs of the day, including probably what was going on in North America, because we're now in the early 1770s and the colonies are rambunctious, not okay, rebellious when it comes to taxes. He gets a reputation, Paine, as being really good with words. And the excise officers on the South Coast, and maybe far beyond that, they come to respect him. And they, in a gathering of these excise officers, which, by the way, was probably illegal because any kind of labor activity was illegal at that time, they choose him to draft a petition and go to London to lobby for a raise in the salaries of the excise officers. By the way, every single thing I just said was illegal at the time. Okay. But Paine, foolhardy perhaps, he takes it on and he writes a petition. It's called the Case of the Excise Officers. And he lays out the challenges and the trials and tribulations of trying to sustain a living, given the small wages and salary available. And he warns, this could lead to corruption, this kind of thing. He goes to London and he spends, it seems like he's definitely there months. Now, he's abandoned his post, you might say, though it's possible that his comrades covered his territory for him. The point is that while he's there, he meets a lot of very important people because he's lobbying, and he makes acquaintance anew of Ben Franklin, or he literally meets him for the first time. We're not sure. I think he's actually meeting him for a second time. Franklin spent more time, I think, in London than he probably ever did in Boston and Philadelphia, because he was the most famous figure of the Atlantic world, and he was the American representative, to whatever extent there was a representative in London. Okay, now,
Right.
all of this catches up to Paine, and he is sacked again. He is fired again. Now, it just so happens that Franklin has taken something of a beating in one of his recent appearances before the Privy Council because of what's going on in America and other things. That's when Franklin is beginning to talk to people who are looking to go to America. He's sort of looking for who would be good in support of the rebellion. Now, we don't know if that's how he viewed Paine. Paine is already, as I said, 37. He has some military experience, but we don't know if he was thinking to himself, I'm going to send Paine to America because he's going to serve the cause. What we do know is that he gives him a letter of introduction. Paine sets sail for America in November of 1774. Okay? Now let's understand what's going on in America at the time. December 1773 was the famous Boston Tea Party. And when that took place,
Right.
the British were fed up. That was it. And they then imposed on Massachusetts and essentially a lot of the other colonies the coercive acts, aka the intolerable acts. Okay. And they send troops to occupy Boston, and basically they remove any of the colonial privileges afforded beforehand to the Bostonians in Massachusetts. The assembly is suspended, etc. Colonies from Massachusetts on down to Georgia, well, definitely through the Carolinas, they are outraged. Okay. They line up with Massachusetts, and thus begins the Continental Congresses. Okay. Now, the other thing is that in towns and cities, Americans, these British Americans, they literally rebel, and I mean rebel, against British authorities. And you might say they literally push them out. They push them out. Okay. But they don't say we're taking over and this is going to be a new country. They push them out, and they continue to fight for what they call the rights of the freeborn Briton, or the rights of the freeborn Englishman. Now, this is notable. Imagine this has gone on for a year. Americans are in a state of clearly rebellion. Edmund Burke, the founding father of modern political conservatism, who is Anglo-Irish and is a member of parliament, he is sympathetic to the rebellion. Not as people think the revolution that will follow, to the rebellion. Now, this is what he does. He writes a speech that he takes to Parliament, and he warns Parliament, his fellow parliamentarians, to be very careful about the next step they take in trying to subdue this American rebelliousness. Here's what he says. The Americans essentially, I've got the full text nearby, have already staged a revolution, but they don't seem to recognize it themselves. Okay? And if we push too hard, they might come to that consciousness of what they have done and what they're capable of. And this is the most interesting part. And he says, and if the Americans do that and succeed, we will suffer. We have to realize we may suffer the same revolution here and all across Europe. In other words, he sees in Americans possibilities. Now, Paine arrives. That was in March 1775. Of course, the very next month is Lexington and Concord. Now, Paine arrives in Philadelphia in January of 1776, and it's worth noting that even in January of 76, listen stupidly, Washington, okay, Washington, when he has dinners with his fellow officers, the first thing they do is they toast the king. For most Americans, the enemy was Parliament. They're the ones who are legislating all this stuff. The king had somehow been able to stand above all of this. But Paine he's come over with a letter from Franklin, luckiest man alive, and I'm sure he appreciated. Within like a week, he becomes the editor of a new magazine being launched out of Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Magazine. Here's a guy with a record that, if anyone realized his record was one of effort, failure, firings and sackings and whatever, who knows what might have happened. But he came with a letter of introduction from Franklin, which is like, it's worth its weight in, like gold.
It was the gold standard. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So Paine, I'm taking so much of this podcast time. We're not going to have much time to talk about where we.
Well, it's good. I mean, because first of all, we'll be able to have you back, and second of all, our breaks are soft, so we can continue. I'm learning a lot, and I'm sure other people are too. So
okay, well,
please,
consider
thank
this.
you.
Yeah, consider this. He's the editor of the magazine, and it's the spring of 1775. He's outraged. He was not, by the way, he was sympathetic to the American Rebellion, but nothing had occurred to him to talk about revolution himself. However, after Lexington and Concord, that shot fired heard round the world, Paine is more and more anti-British. He already hated Britain and the king. He already hated the king. I mean, it was the King's Excise Commission that hired and fired him. Okay. He hated the fact that the inequality and poverty that prevailed in England prevented anyone from having a decent chance of making a decent living if they weren't already born into some kind of money. And America, he said, was like, except for slavery. That's the one thing that truly disturbed him when he came to Philadelphia. What he saw in America was practically paradise. Keep in mind, Philadelphia was a very diverse city. You had just about every Western religion imaginable was present. The Quakers basically were the founders of Philadelphia, but you had Anglicans, Episcopal Anglicans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Jews, Catholics. They were all in that community. And as far as Paine could tell, the animosities were slight. The antagonisms were slight. And,
Right.
I mean, that wasn't the case throughout the colonies, but Philadelphia was, or should be, or became known as the city of brotherly love, right? Okay, so that's first. Second of all, they were from all parts of the world. All these men and women who were demanding the rights of freeborn Englishmen, a lot of them weren't even English themselves. They were originally from Germany or France or the Scandinavian countries. By the way, there were also both slaves and free blacks. There were Native Americans, not only outside of Philadelphia, but in. And Paine thought this was extraordinary. He was just, to use our own term, he was blown away by this. So he started to imagine possibilities, and he called for, in writing, for an end of slavery. Okay. Now, in those days, nobody signed their names in magazine articles. But there was one member of the Second Continental Congress. His name was Benjamin Rush, a young, relatively radical doctor who had studied medicine at Edinburgh. And he was part of the crew that included sort of Jefferson, Adams, those guys, you might say, who later would, see themselves as the ones calling for independence, but they had to be pushed to do it, as you'll see. Rush comes to the magazine and says, "I'd like to meet the man who wrote the piece calling for the end of slavery." Why? Because Rush had done so a year or two before himself, but he had suffered abuse. People had attacked him for having done so, because even though a lot of Philadelphians didn't own slaves, a goodly number did, and there was a slave market in Philadelphia. He meets Paine, and they begin this conversation in coffee shops and probably taverns as well. At a certain point, Rush says to him, and by the way, don't forget, he's a member of the Continental Congress. He says to Paine, "You really ought to write a pamphlet calling for a separation from England." Radical idea. And Paine was already primed to think, wow, it's a good idea. But Paine says to him, "Well, why don't you do that?" And Rush says to him, "I have too much to lose if I'm discovered as the author of that." Which is to say, he was essentially saying to Paine, "Hey, you got nothing to lose, man." Right?
Right. This needs to be someone who can't fall any lower.
Yes. Well, again, maybe Paine was both brave and foolhardy. He takes on the idea. What a great idea. He eventually leaves the magazine, which is a whole story in itself, and he commits himself to writing the pamphlet Common Sense. And he does. I mean, he's already in touch. Franklin, I believe, has gotten back to Philadelphia. He's got materials that he's secured from other people to help inform his writing. And the pamphlet Common Sense, interestingly enough, it opens not with any call for independence. It opens up with a vision of people being essentially sociable and instinctively democratic. And I can't go through the whole thing, or we'll be here too long, but I will tell you this. He opens up with that, and he then attacks British government and the Constitution and the King, all of them being a farce. And it isn't just that he calls them a farce, he displays exactly why it's farcical. So, for example, the English Constitution, which has never been written down, by the way, the English Constitution provides for these divisions between lords and commons and a king. And if the king can overrule them, what kind of parliament is it? I mean, he takes it apart. Okay, just takes it apart.
If I can just jump in, it's very much a refutation of Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan and the entire justification of the English monarchy and everything. Continue, please. Okay. I just wanted to jump in.
No, that's cool. That's absolutely cool. The most important. Then he moves on to the part which is most relevant as you know, I did a podcast last weekend with your and my friend RJ Eskow, Richard Eskow, specifically on the No Kings and Thomas Paine being the champion of No Kings way back in 1776. And in fact, if anything, every single person at the No Kings protests and rallies should probably go read Common Sense just to fortify themselves. Okay. Well, he goes after the very idea of kings. I mean, he just strips it down to its raw stupidity. Okay. And at one point, he then says, and to think that these kings are also afforded hereditary succession. And the line I love the
Right.
most is something like, just think if if that were worth anything, then nature would not so often give people an ass instead of a lion for a king. Okay. I mean, I'm paraphrasing actually, but that's essentially it. Well, anyhow, he
Right.
then says, and this is really important, he holds up a mirror, essentially, a word mirror, in which he describes what it means to be an American. And he's trying to get people to realize whether you're from Virginia, Massachusetts, wherever you're from, whatever your national or ethnic background is, you're American. And if two people from the colonies meet somewhere overseas, they immediately recognize each other as fellow Americans, not as Virginians or New Englanders, whatever. And he points out that being a part of the British Empire, which is supposed to protect Americans, hardly does. It drags us into all the imperial wars that Britain has. Okay, and don't forget the French in quotes, the French and Indian wars that have taken place back in the 1760s. Americans haven't forgotten that, and of course they're being taxed to pay for the debts that the British ran up to fight the French and Indian wars. Of course, the British said, "Hell, we fought to defend you guys. You owe us something." But that's not the point. The
Right. Well,
Americans.
and I'll jump in again because this is a history of Appalachia that doesn't get told
Oh
thoroughly
yeah,
enough. Also,
right.
is that so much of what is now Appalachia was basically given to certain groups of people. The Scots Irish are the ones that are most prominently known as the buffer between, okay,
Right,
the Indians are out there
right.
and the
That's right.
coastal cities, the cosmopolitan places are here. You all go out there. You guys
Yeah,
do that. And those folks were terribly disgruntled with the king because they didn't want to respect the treaties that the British and the Indians were trying to come up with to try to settle some of this. And all of that is, kind of essential beginnings of the Appalachian region. And considering this is the Blue Ridge Breakdown, I wanted to take the opportunity to add that context in for listeners too.
absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. Um, and by the way, I'll jump way ahead. I talk about all of this in my book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. Thomas Paine's writings, by the way, after the American Revolution, after 1800, the powerful, the propertied, the pious, the prestigious, all of these folks, all the elites in America went out of their way to suppress Thomas Paine's memory because of his radicalism in the American Revolution and thereafter. And this is interesting. There there have been I've read a number of books that talk about life in and beyond the Appalachian Mountains in the early 19th century and through the 19th century. And one of the fascinating things is they would talk about the books that were regularly advertised in newspapers out in the West. And people would then talk about libraries. People might have kept books in their home. Thomas Paine's writings were the most popular writings, aside from the Bible, probably in all America, but especially in Appalachia. And later in
That's
the 1790s, everyone thinks that the Democratic Party, that's all rooted somehow in the Democratic Republican societies that emerged out in Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia at the time, and South. But actually, when they formed these groups of small d Democrats who were trying to avoid the power of the bankers and merchants of the East, what inspired them was Thomas Paine's rights of man that he wrote over in France during the French Revolution. And in fact, it was, you might say that in some ways, the Democratic Party owes more to the writings of Thomas Paine, who at that point wasn't even in the United States, than perhaps to Jefferson's initiatives. But Jefferson and Paine were friends, and as a consequence, they would have shared the responsibility and the reputation. Anyhow, let me come back. So he writes Common Sense, publishes it in January when, as I said, everyone else is still toasting the king. And it takes off. I mean, it just explodes in the American imagination. Okay, he's shown them that they are not British, that they are American, and he says all we've been waiting for is a plan. So he says, "I'll offer one." He offers a plan. Okay, not that it should be the plan, but he just wants to get the conversation going, and he lays out a relatively democratic idea of a constitution. Okay, representation, freedom of worship. I mean, it's a significant offering. He lays it all out in like 2 or 3 pages of Common Sense. And people loved it. And he goes on to explain this, and this is important. Fundamental to the new country must be a democratic republic. He doesn't use the word democracy, but he makes it clear by reference to representation. And it should also have, and he's very absolute about this, separation of church and state. There's a line in Common Sense which is phenomenal. It says, the only role for government in religion is to make sure everyone can practice it as they please. Very radical for its day. And by the way, significant because in Virginia, soon to be West Virginia as well, but even in the Loudoun County, in those eastern parts of Virginia, there was the emergence, especially in the rural areas, of Methodist, Baptists, and Presbyterians whose numbers were small to begin with, but they were growing rapidly. In part because they didn't care for the idea that the elites of Virginia were all Anglicans. Washington, all
Right.
and the whole crew were Anglicans. And they were afraid that the Anglicans were going to try to impose a bishop on Virginia, the colony, even though there were, among those elites were some very serious folks who believed in freedom of religion and separation of church and state, like George Mason and Jefferson himself. But this is all due to Paine's writing in this Common Sense, where these farmers say, hell, we may not have had any interest in a revolution before because we don't, last thing we want to do is give all the power to these Anglican elites. But no, he's talking, Paine, about democracy, basically, and separation of church and state. And so folks, even in areas, by the way, you'll not be surprised, some of the today reddest areas of the country, in the beginning, they were the ones who fought most fervently for separation of church and state, number one. And number two, they were the ones who were inspired by the radicalism of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Okay, I can go through the whole story, but I don't have to. The point is, communities, North and South, start sending letters and petitions to the Continental Congress, calling for the Congress to declare independence. And so finally, the likes that I referred to before of Rush and Jefferson and Adams and the others, they organize a committee. What ensues is the Declaration of Independence. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, the American colony's total population, including slaves that were about 500,000 slaves, was 3 million. Paine's pamphlet in pamphlet form sold 120,000 copies. And every single newspaper excerpted. And by the way, there were no royalties paid for those kinds of excerptings. But the other thing was, Paine said, if there are any royalties, I want them to go to Washington's troops to buy them mittens to make it through the winters. So Paine decided he was going to take no profits from what he did. By the way, it's said that by the end of the Revolution, 500,000 copies were made available. I will also tell you, and this is not just Harvey J saying it, I'm not the only historian who says this, during the time of the Revolution, Common Sense was considered a more important document, perhaps, than the Declaration. So, and how do we know that? Well, the best way to put it is that around campfires, the troops would toast Common Sense, not the Declaration. After the revolution succeeds, the Declaration becomes the more important document, okay? The founding document, you might say.
Right.
Okay. So that's the basic story of Paine, but I leave it to you if we go on with this now or we continue with it elsewhere. I will tell people this is where we're going, whether we do it today or another day. Thomas Paine ends up encouraged by Franklin, goes back to Europe because he wants to build an iron bridge. He loved science and technology, and his plan was he had designed an iron bridge, and he wanted to build one over the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. Now, why? Why is that important? Anyone who knows their geography of the East Coast knows that all the towns on the East Coast, cities, they're all at the mouths of rivers. So if you're going to travel, let's say you're going to travel from Boston to Charleston, whatever, you're going to have to cross a lot of rivers if you're going to do it on horseback or carriage, whatever else. In the winter, yeah, they freeze over. But that very freezing process can literally destroy the bridge
Right.
as it freezes and unfreezes, that kind of thing. So if you're going to travel, you had to travel by ship or by boat, basically. Paine wanted to unite the colonies, now states, all the more effectively. So his idea was it's a United States. It has to be physically united. We need iron bridges, right? Up and down the East Coast. But there was no money. The bank didn't exist to fund it. So Franklin said, go back to Europe, go to England, go to London, go to Paris, get endorsements, raise the money over there. I'll leave it at this. He goes back. He gets a lot of endorsements. He's having a very hard time raising the money, however. However, in 1789, July 14th, the Bastille is stormed by the working people of Paris. The French Revolution begins, and that's a whole story in which Paine gets wrapped up in it. Now, I'll just say this. Paine was the greatest radical of a decidedly radical age. The greatest radical of a radical age.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you laid out that history. And yeah, what I invited you to talk about today was about that, the broadest sense of social security that really starts with Paine. And I mean, do you have 10 more minutes? Can we do 10
Oh,
minutes talking
absolutely.
about
Yeah.
that?
Oh,
Or
I've
should
got 10 more
we?
minutes.
Okay. And we
Okay.
can also, you should come back
Well,
and
here's the
we
thing.
can pick up a ton of different places, but go ahead
Okay.
from there,
I'll
please.
tell you what, I will give people a sense of direction as to, and we'll do the fuller story next time.
Perfect.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
Okay. Paine goes back. So he's back in Europe and he's having a hard time raising the money. That in itself was not the cause for his writing about Social Security. Okay. But what happens is when he gets back to Europe, he is reminded about just how awful life in Europe is. The inequality is, to put it mildly, gross. Okay. I mean,
Right.
Paris and London alike.
And there's no social mobility, as you talked
No
about
social
earlier,
mobility.
too. I mean,
No,
it's a
no, so,
very
right,
rigid hierarchical
right.
structure.
Social mobility for a lot of people meant becoming an indentured servant, getting on a ship and coming to America to work
Right.
as a semi-slave for some years. By the way, I didn't mention the kind of exploitation that prevailed in America when Paine arrives, other than slavery. I mean, the inequality in America existed, prevailed, and the
Right.
elites in America always worried about slave rebellion possibilities of their servants slitting their throats. I mean, let's not forget. But compared to what existed in Europe, because don't forget, if an indentured servant wanted to escape the servitude, which was illegal, he'd just head west, or or if they're married, perhaps they'd head west into
Right.
into Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, not to Western Massachusetts so easily, maybe on to New York. So
Right.
that's upward mobility, you might say. Okay.
Right. Right.
Okay. But that meant coming all the way across the Atlantic. And you had to, and by the way, a lot of people, it doesn't only, I mean, Africans died in mass in the slave trade, but a lot of whites who came over as indentured servant were intending to arrive as indentured servants died along the way. There were a lot of diseases you would pick up on board those ships, and indentured servants did not come on board regularly. They're often down below, not
Right.
in the conditions of a slave, but not much better, quite perhaps. Paine came over sick, deathly sick, of what they used to call ship's fever. I guess it was typhus, something like that, and had to be carried off in Philadelphia on a stretcher. But luckily for him, he had enough money to get to a boarding house and recover at the boarding house. He didn't have a lot of money, but he had enough money to do that. Okay, so when he's in Europe, he's seeing this the horrors that he remembered when he was a young man and a boy. And he basically says, he decides that, well, first of all, let me just say, Edmund Burke is horrified by the French Revolution. He's a conservative. People don't have the right to mess with tradition, with hierarchy.
Right.
Okay. Especially common people. How dare they? Okay. He says, you just don't do that. And he lays out in a book length, it was called a pamphlet, but it was a book length work, Reflections on the Revolution in France. He's warning his fellow Britons not to allow for the likes of the French Revolution. Paine, who's now between London and Paris, back and forth, let's say he's mostly in London at this point, he's really upset because he had bought the idea that Burke had strong sympathies for the American cause. And what he's doing is he's saying, look, we don't end a monarchy. Okay. We don't have the right to end a monarchy. But hell, what he's saying is, what those Americans did is unacceptable. So Paine decides he's going to answer Burke. Others did too, and I don't have time to go into that. But Paine answered in what then becomes the bestseller ever in Europe. And it's in two parts. The first part is called Rights of Man. And in that Rights of Man, he basically lays out an argument like he laid out as, one like he wrote in Common Sense about the imperative of ending monarchy, and think about all the good that could come of ending monarchy. It's really brilliant. And he says basically, and Americans have provided the example. He celebrates America right from the beginning. There's that thing in physics. If we could, it goes way back. If you had a place to stand upon, you could move the earth. Okay.
Right.
Well, Paine says America has provided the place to stand upon. We can change the world. I should add, I left out the key line in Common Sense. Hold on. I gotta throw something in my throat because I'm talking so fast and furiously that I gotta.
It's okay.
There's a line towards the end it's not in the very first printing. In the next printing that Paine approves, he has an appendix. And he says, the birthday of a new world is at hand. We, Americans, have it in our power to begin the world over again, which, by the way, is the most revolutionary statement in human history. I mean, it's just unbelievable, right? And so now he's saying to the Brits in that pamphlet and to other Europeans and others who would read this, yes, we have a place to stand upon, the American story, to move the world in that way. Anyhow, he's now in trouble. Okay, he's in trouble because he's in England calling basically for the end of the monarchy. Going to make the long story short and tell you that he goes on to write a second volume of Rights of Man. It's called Rights of Man Part 2. In there, he says, even ever more bluntly, well, just think, if we got rid of the monarchy and the aristocracy and all the money that's given to those people, think of what we could do. And he sets out this. I'm going to read from my book, if you don't mind.
Please.
Paine did more than censure Britain's political order. Reviving the plan. By the way, when he first went to America, he thought about writing something like this, but gave it up because he was so impressed by what he found. Reviving the plan he had begun to formulate years earlier, but had set aside in his encounter with America, he extended his radical democratic thinking by outlining a series of welfare programs that a revolutionary change in government would afford, along with suggesting a progressive estate tax to limit accumulation of property. He recommended raising the incomes of the poor by giving back their taxes and augmenting those taxes with the monies no longer to be provided to the king and the aristocracy. That was one. Distribute special relief for families with children. Create a system of social security for the elderly. Institute public funding of education. At that point, through a voucher system. Today, that's the conservative argument, but that he would no longer argue that. I'm convinced, given what he says. Providing financial support for newly married couples and new mothers, and establishing an employment centers for the jobless. In other words, job centers to make sure the unemployed would get jobs. That's his first stab at what we would call social democracy. I say this unreservedly. Thomas Paine is the father of modern social democracy. But that's just the beginning. Where we really want to go, and by the way, I can give you the basic. No, I don't. I hate to jump over it like this. In the 1790s, he is he's arrested, by the way. Oh God, it's so much I'm leaving out. I have to come back. But I do want you to know, in a pamphlet, his final great pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, he lays out a vision, the true vision for Social Security, which includes not only payments to people reaching a certain age at the upper end, but also monies to be given to young people when they reach a certain age so they don't start life in poverty. And I will explain all that and his argument, because his argument is essential for us today. He never wants any of this to be seen as charity. And I'll leave it at that because I want to tell the story when we come back.
Beautiful. And thank you. And there is so much more to cover. And yes, I mean, we can pick up when you come back we'll find a date here sometime soon,
Okay.
and just talk about Thomas Paine and agrarian justice. Uh, People who have been following the Substack or the Blue Ridge Breakdown on YouTube or however people are following it. If you're Nancy Altman and me last week, we touched on that in context of the big ass Social Security program that we
Oh,
currently have.
did she
But
mention agrarian justice?
I mentioned it, and
Mm.
I gave her a leading question on it.
Because if I will tell people if they to prepare them if they wish, unless the Trump administration has literally raped the Social Security website. When you go there and you look under the history of Social Security, you'll notice a name, Thomas Paine. I'll leave it at that.
Exactly. And the guest has been again Professor Harvey K, Harvey J.K., and the book that I need to get myself a copy of. If you speak, then you'll make sure it'll be on camera. But yeah, Harvey, say something so that you speak.
Thomas Paine and the Promise of America is the title of the book. And he was my
Perfect.
childhood hero. Just remember that.
And that should pop up right there. And on that, I think the perfect note to start ending the Blue Ridge Breakdown on is we have it in our power to make the world anew. Thank you again for your time today, Harvey. And I'm
Pleasure.
really looking forward to picking this up.
I'm already looking forward to it, believe me.